Here's a dilemma skeptics like to dish out. If God is all-powerful, it means that he can do anything. Anything includes sinning. But if it's true that God can sin, well, then God isn't perfectly good. If on the other hand, God cannot sin, then God doesn't seem to be all-powerful, because there is at least one thing, namely sinning, that God cannot do. It almost seems like skeptics have exposed a theological loophole Christians have never thought of for the last 2000 years. So what do we make of this? God is a maximally great being, which means, among other things, that he's maximally good and that he has maximal power. Now, there's an erroneous assumption that comes with the dilemma the skeptic poses. Namely, the assumption that sinning is one of the powers or capacities an all-powerful God possesses. However, sinning isn't actually a capacity in and of itself. Instead, it is the lack of capacity. Sinning means that you're missing the mark of moral perfection. Living up to the standard of moral perfection takes a certain power. A power which we human beings, but not God, fall short of. So to say that God cannot sin does not and cannot undermine God's power, since sinning isn't a power anyway. Or to put it the other way around, if sinning isn't a power to begin with, then how does saying that God cannot sin matter to God's all-powerfulness? Well, it doesn't matter in the slightest, because a thing that's a non-power cannot add or take away from God's all-powerfulness. Consider also that if there were a possibility that God could sin, it would essentially mean that God is subject to something that could thwart his maximal greatness. Now, a maximally great being that's susceptible to a greatness undermining influence is certainly not as great as a being that is under no such influence. Thus, defining God as a maximally great being rules out the possibility of God sinning. The skeptic's dilemma can be answered from yet another angle. Sinning, while being a matter of missing the mark of moral perfection, can also be defined as doing not as God wills. However, it is absurd to suggest that God can do other than as God wills. God, as a morally perfect being, wills moral perfection. To suggest that God should be able to sin, that is, that he should be able to do other than he wills, is a self-contradictory suggestion. And so again, the fact that God cannot sin has nothing to do with a supposed lack of God's power, but it has everything to do with the logical incoherence of the suggestion itself. Still, the skeptic might object and say, man, all I'm saying is that there should be a theoretical possibility of God sinning. This doesn't mean that he will actually sin. In other words, he should have the freedom to sin even if he never acted upon it. Wouldn't a God who is exposed to the possibility of sinning while never actually committing a sin be greater than a God who's shielded from such a possibility? Again, the suggestion is based on a misunderstanding of what sin is. We said that sin is missing the mark of moral perfection and doing other than what God wills. But no one, not even God, can do other than he wills. And it's the laws of logic that establish this impossibility, which is why suggesting some possibility of God sinning is simply illogical and absurd. In contrast, it makes complete sense to say that for other beings, like human beings, sinning is a possibility, because it is logically possible that we will do something other than what God wills. That is, we can do what we will. Furthermore, when we say that sin is missing the mark of moral perfection and that God is a perfect being, this precludes, by definition, the possibility of him missing the mark of moral perfection. Human beings are not perfect, but imperfect, which means by definition that there is the possibility of us missing the mark of moral perfection. But trying to force the possibility of sinning, that is, the possibility of missing moral perfection, onto a being that is by definition morally perfect is a contradiction in terms, because being morally perfect implies the impossibility of falling into moral imperfection. So, saying that a morally perfect God who is exposed to the possibility of sinning is superior to a morally perfect God who is not, is like saying that a circle that can possibly be squared is superior to a circle that cannot be squared. There is no such thing as a circle that could possibly be squared. Neither is there a morally perfect being that could also possibly be imperfect or possibly do other than it wills. Possibly perfect, though, could be the claim of skeptics that there are contradictions in the Gospel's crucifixion narratives. If you want to find out why or why not, check out this video over here. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.